adjust our mics. Lovely to see you all. Thanks very much for coming along this evening. Welcome to the National Library of Scotland. My name's Amina Shah. I'm the National Librarian and Chief Exec of the National Library, and I'm absolutely delighted to have Carse Wilson here this evening to talk about his debut novel, Fray, which quite frankly is probably one of the most talked about novels in recent times. There's been such a great buzz around this, Chris, so it's fantastic to have you here. So just to start off, maybe it'd be useful just to give an overview of Fray. What is the plot? Tell us what the structure is.
Thank you. And, thank you for having me here. It's a great privilege to be here. So the novel opens... I'm green?
Yeah.
It's okay? We're good?
Yep, we're good.
So the novel opens with a father who's run away to the Highlands of Scotland after the death of his wife, and their child rushes away to try and find him. But all the child finds is an abandoned cottage filled with thousands of paper notes. And in the notes, the father is describing how he's convinced that actually the mother's somehow not dead, that she's hidden in the light, in the wind and the weather, and that she's somehow there to be found. So the novel is exploring the experience.
Chris, sorry, I'm just going to pass this microphone.
Yeah.
Just a little bit low for everybody. So if you can just...
Sure.
Sorry. Thanks.
Is that better for everyone? Yeah, lovely. Good. Okay. Shall we go again?
Yes.
Lovely. Okay. It's still the same. So the novel opens with a father running away to the Highlands of Scotland, chased after by a grown-up child. The child's desperately trying to find him. All they find is a cottage filled with thousands and thousands of paper notes where the father is describing attempts to try and locate his dead wife. He's somehow convinced that she's still alive, that she's there to be found. And then as the novel progresses, quite early on, there's a third voice that perhaps we'll talk a little bit about that starts bleeding into the story, that is challenging the narrator, that's challenging the father, that's unsettling what we as readers might think we know is going on with the book.
It's honestly, I was lucky enough to get a proof copy, as you can see, and it's mesmerising in the way that you've written it. And I wonder, Chris, could we just ask you to read something just now so that people can get a sense of the rhythm and the style?
Yeah. So I'll sort of introduce this. So that this is the first page of the book. And just as a tiny bit of background, I mean, I started writing this back in 2016. We were up in Glencoe on a family holiday. The book isn't specifically located there, but that environment was sort of the spark for it. And what started it is I'd wanted to commit myself to writing a book. So I'd always written for myself, I'd always written in secret, and I really wanted the challenge of trying to finish something, frankly. But I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't know where I wanted to go and what I wanted to really write about, other than I had a sense that somehow it would touch on mental health and somehow that would address my own challenges that I've always lived with. The moment, which this was written immediately after, was going on a run up a mountain and being caught out in a storm. So I was there in this huge landscape, as you can imagine, if you've been to Glencoe or seen it, and I was caught out by the weather and terrified, frankly. So the book opens with this. Sometimes all you can do is climb to the peak of the nearest mountain and scream at the top of your voice, "Devil, devil, devil." That might buy you some more time to run. This was the first note I read. Not long after discovering the cottage he'd been hiding in for nearly a year, or perhaps not hiding, but certainly hidden. Dad disappeared shortly after Mum died, shortly after I drove him away. He took her death badly, but not in the usual sense. Dad didn't believe in the truth of it. He thought she was elsewhere, not gone, but discoverable. He thought she was there to be found. And I found, eventually, this near derelict abandoned cottage hidden in the forests and mountains of northern Scotland, somewhere they used to go before I was born, but somewhere we never went as a family. A special place, but a hidden place even then. Inside was a sea of writing spread over every surface. Crude, hand-drawn maps and ripped pieces of paper thrown everywhere. A giant jigsaw tipped out of its box.
So you get a sense of the sort of sparse nature of Chris's writing then, that sort of pulls the story along. And the writing itself was done on the bus. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, from that moment in sort of the autumn of 2016, I started it. So I had that first, came back from the run, freezing cold, wet, and on my phone tapped out more or less what is still the first page of the book. That was the start. I didn't really know what I was going to do with it. It was very much, I'd never written a novel before, and it's interesting. I mean, now that I've done one and starting on another, it's really interesting, all the things you don't know and all the dead ends you go down. So you're writing in the darkness. You're not sure. I had a vague sense of where it would end, but I didn't know what would happen on the journey to it. I had a sense of the feeling I wanted the reader to go through in their journey, but how I put that together and what happened to the characters, I didn't have at that point. And back then I was working, as I still am, but I was working with V&A Dundee, so it was a couple of years before the museum was due to open, and we were all working every hour of the day, and the only time I had was 10 or 15 minutes on the bus going in, and then 10 or 15 minutes on the bus coming back out again. And I would sit with my phone and I would just kind of tap through and would try and put something together. And I think back then it was purely a functional thing. I didn't have the time or the energy to come home, start the evening, sit down and then write for an hour, because I was then back on emails worrying about construction and photography and whatever else. But what was really interesting is that entirely unintentionally, that process of knowing you've got 10 minutes until you're going to arrive, or you've got 5 minutes, or I physically see where I need to get off the bus, or I'm going to be late for work, whatever it might be, meant that I was racing while I was writing. So certainly early on, the interplay between the narrator and the father and the notes, where they're quite short, they're quite sharp. Each note might have been a good bus trip if I could focus and get something down. But it meant that I had that same, in moments, a similar sense of panic to what the characters are going through. So I was pushing and racing and chasing after things in a way that they are too.
Yeah, and I think that really comes across. That sense, that rhythm, that's how it's so interesting, the story that you were on. And not to be recommended, or would you recommend people write that way?
I don't know. I mean, I think it is to be recommended. I mean, we're all guilty of sitting on Instagram for 10 or 20 minutes and maybe not achieving terribly much. But if you point that time at something else, possibly there's a book in there. I mean, I think it's, as well, it kind of speaks, though, to that I started writing it with no particular desire, no intention of publishing it. So I was writing it because I felt, the personal challenge of completing a book, but also because I wanted to find a way of using language, of using the form of fiction to deal with mental health. So creating it and working through my own situation, my own challenges, was far more important than any sort of future goal. So I think there's something, what's to be recommended is the bus the perfect place to do it? No, but if that's the 10 minutes you have. But I think what almost is more important is that I wasn't doing it, nobody knew I was doing it, I wasn't doing it for anybody else. And that then became a space in which it could be just for me. So that almost is the bit that mattered most, I guess.
And so when did you sort of reveal it to the world then, in that sense?
So I mean, the first draft, excuse me, took about 4 years, and we'd all gone into lockdown with COVID, and this was period. I obviously wasn't on the bus at that point, but I finished it later into 2020, or what I thought was finished. And at that point shared it with my wife and sort of started from there. But even at that point, it was very much, here's a thing I'm proud to have done. I'd love you to see what you think of it. And, I think in my head that was the end of it.
How did she react?
Well, she's going to kick me when I get home because she's watching at home. I think, first of all, I get, I don't know, obsessed, committed to certain interests, passions, hobbies and things. So sometimes I might be fascinated with something and really, this is because I'm autistic, this is an area of what people call special interest. So there are some things I get really, really into, possibly for a short period of time, possibly for longer. So I think probably up front, maybe there was a sense of thinking, that's been the thing I've been laser focused on. But then she had a look at it and she's like, oh, right, so you've really written a book. There's not just like some words on your phone that sort of kind of make vague sense. She's like, God, this is all right. Maybe there's something else there. And I think that, there's been various, that was the first one, but there's been various points at which, showing it to one person, showing it to somebody else, very slowly, very, very carefully. But I think that over a period of months got me to the point of just enough confidence to think, to transition from thinking I needed to write this for myself to understand my own mental health, to then thinking, okay, so if other people are telling me this is pretty good, first of all, I should listen to them, I love them and respect them. But also is the job of publishing here and sharing the work that actually this could be meaningful to somebody else. And that was the turnaround, like 6 months or so after finishing the first draft, of thinking maybe there's more that this book can do that connects to why I was doing it in the first place.
And last week, I was lucky enough to go to the launch of Fray, and your agent, Jenny, was talking there, and she said that when she saw it, she just thought, wow, this has absolutely got to, we've got to do something with this. And she also made the point that last week you were in The Guardian and you had a double-page spread, and the only other author that she's worked with that's had that is Barack Obama. So for her, yeah, exactly. Well done. But for a first-time writer, that must have, you've gone from you not really thinking of yourself as a writer, writing for yourself, writing for your mental health, doing it in secret on your 10-minute bus journey back and forward across the bridge, and then to suddenly people saying, wow, this is great, and having this great success. How does that feel, that shift?
It's really strange, yeah. It's lovely, and it's very, very flattering. But I think how am I trying to say this? I think the thing that I found really interesting through this whole process, so from the process of being introduced through a mutual friend to Jenny, who's amazing. She used to be publisher at Canongate, unbelievable level of experience. From that to here is about 2 years. So, meeting her, working with her, pitching to publishers, picking up a publisher, then they bought it, then it's about 18 months to this point. I think the thing that that's particularly sort of satisfying when you get these lovely responses, and thank you for yours as well, is I could have easily given up on it at any moment during that point, even with an agent and even with a publisher. There were so many times where I thought, I don't know if this is good enough, firstly, but also I don't know, I'm not, it's very interesting creating something and sharing, your own identity as a creative person for the first time. So my career has always been in journalism and then in communications, where I've helped promote lots of other people. So, launch V&A Dundee, or before that at Abertay University, working with amazing video game designers and wonderful people, to sort of shift in your own understanding of yourself as, I am creative, I can, be that. I think that's the bit about the reviews and the press coverage, is like, okay, maybe that's real, maybe I can believe that a little bit more now.
No, that's so interesting. So back to the setting and the story, I'm interested in that you went for this run up north, and the whole thing, in the main, apart from some reflection back, is set in the Highlands. And what is it about the Highlands and Scotland that made this the right setting for you?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I think there's something about that environment. And as I said before, the book is, the characters aren't named, but also the location isn't named. So it's, it's actually been really interesting. Your friends who are much more sort of outdoorsy than I am, coming to me and telling me that they're absolutely convinced it's this area or that area, and they're all different. And I suppose in a way it is that, because it's a composite environment. It's fragments of different things. But what I love particularly about that bit of Scotland, and the journey from over on this side as you go up to it, is there's something about driving up, how the landscape changes, and your relationship to it. But also, once you get into Glencoe itself, which is very steep side, it's huge, your understanding of your scale in comparison to the mountains, I find really fascinating. And, as you are writing the book about that feeling of the landscape moving around you, like shifting, and it's getting bigger, but that you feel like you're getting smaller and smaller, and possibly then less significant as a result. I think the feeling I had on that run was, as well as it being really quite frightening, when the weather came in and the visibility just went, is, of being completely at the mercy of the landscape and being at the mercy of the weather. And I wanted to, I've always been drawn to books or to theatre or to different things where there's an intensity to the experience, that you're immersed, that you lose yourself in it. And I think that was one of the starting principles, is how, just, with words on a page, how can I create an experience that feels like I'm halfway up this mountain and I can't see anything, and I'm wet and I'm cold and I'm frightened. And then the other bit that was just kind of in the background is the feeling that, we all might, we will all have different mental health challenges at different scales in our lives. That's inescapable, sadly. But actually seeing the storm, it felt like seeing out in the real world what it can feel like inside. And I was really interested in how to draw those connections between what became the narrator and the father, their own experiences, and how that is in the landscape as well. And I love the West Coast. I love, used to go on holidays to Lewis and Harris when I was young. But there was just something about the scale there, and helplessness, and just feeling really lost. And I wanted to somehow put that into a book.
And it really comes across. And even the weather is mentioned quite a lot. So the main character is reading notes, and then sometimes it's raining outside, so they decide not to go for a run, and then the impact of that. But also the darkness, and dark and light features in it quite strongly, which is always true when you're up north, or you're relying on that. And so this isn't the character, to be clear. You don't gender them at all. And it's not you, but it sounds like there are some elements of you in the character. Is that fair to say?
No, that's completely fair. And I think, so, so what you read in the book, the narrator is entirely, it's, in moments like a diary where they're recording in a linear line their exploration of trying to find the father and reading through the father's notes. But the father's notes come as they're found in piles, in a great big mess, so they're not in order. The narrator then, just as a function of that, it's all in the first person. They're just talking about themselves, but they're not, I'm giving nothing really clearly about, I'm not naming them, I'm not gendering them. And the point of that was, that was one of the things that really, because I've tried writing lots of other things before that have been, that haven't worked. And that was one of the decisions that really felt like the book, like the writing started to take off. Because again, come back to that idea about creating an intense experience, about dealing with grief, with mental health, with what that could mean to a reader. So I wanted to remove any barrier that a reader might have to thinking that this is off somewhere else or happening to someone else. I wanted people, if they wish to engage in it in this way, which is entirely up to them, but I wanted people to feel that that could be them. So it's really interesting. So some people gender the narrator to themselves. Some people gender the narrator as male because of me. There's different reactions to it. But to the question about kind of who they are, I suppose it's similar to the landscape. So the landscape is fragments of bits of the Highlands, particularly Glencoe, but elsewhere as well, broken up, mixed around, and then developed into something totally new. I think it's probably fair to say that the narrator, there's a similar sort of process going on. So there's bits of my own experience. There's bits about the narrator actually struggling at university. I went to university in Edinburgh, so some of those, doesn't particularly connect, again, directly to me, but there's little bits of things that I experienced or I found interesting. It's like, okay, so I'm going to take these pieces, I'm going to move them around a bit, and then I'm going to build it into something that's bigger than that. So it's not exactly me, thankfully.
And I was really glad to see both your parents alive and well at the launch event. Yes. So that's how I know it's not completely autobiographical, which is a relief after you read the book. I think the relationship with the parents is interesting, and the child, the grown-up child in this, is chasing them and looking for fragments, or chasing the father who's been chasing the mother. And I got a little bit of a feeling through it that their relationship was almost stronger than the relationship between them and their child, and that the child felt separate. But later on, towards the end of the novel, you get this, without giving any giveaways, you get a sense that perhaps that's been a perception that they have come to themselves. Yeah. Is that,
Yeah, no, we can sort of talk that through a little bit more. I think, part of what I'm wanting to do with the book is, readers could pick it up and they could enjoy a story of one character trying to find another character in the Highlands, and will they or won't they, and it's tense and it's dramatic and everything else, and that could be one way to read it, and that's fantastic. Other readers may come to it and may have a certain unease about what's actually going on, about what the father's saying, the father's own state of mind, what the narrator's saying, and their state of mind. And then I think this plays to what we talked about a little bit earlier about this third voice that comes in. So quite early on, the father's, well, it's right at the first page, the mention of a devil. The father has this obsession that there is this, whether they're a character, whether they're some sort of force of nature, whatever they might be, that is somehow keeping the mother from him, somehow thwarting his attempts to find them. And there's very deliberately, there's a tension in the book, as you say, about the grown-up child feeling separated from the parents and the strength of their relationship, somehow feeling forgotten, literally left behind. But there are parts where you get a sense of, is the narrator understanding everything? So one way of looking at it is this devil voice, this other possible character, inner voice, whatever it might be, is undermining their own attempts to find things. So I'm trying to not give away massive parts of it, but there's a sense in which what they're finding may be being corrupted, whether that's by themselves or by something else. And as you say, later, and that there's a shift, a really important shift. And that comes back to what I said before about how I always knew how the thing should feel, even before I knew what the events and what the plotting and everything would be, that sense of separation and grief and a resolution of a sort, which doesn't give anything away, how that could be a really interesting way to try and set it up.
And this other voice, so sort of structurally in the novel, there's the voice of the character, of the child, and then there are the notes from the father. And then there's this other voice. But there aren't no other voices apart from that throughout. And that other voice style is a purposeful sort of technique in a sense, isn't it? And I know that you are an admirer of Max Porter and Lanny and that sort of thing. Was that a struggle for you? And also Lincoln in the Bardo, George Saunders. Was it something that you were keen to do, sort of build in experimentation, but do it in your own way? Or did it just come out?
I mean, it's so for anybody who's not sort of picked up a book or seen the pages yet, that third voice is presented all in caps, all in bold. It's really interesting how some people read that as being a very aggressive third voice, and others take it as being very quiet and very sinister. So there's sort of a range of views on how that might sit. To Max and George, I came across their work after starting this and after kind of setting up the three character thing. But what was, I think, important about, because I read Lanny first and I read Lincoln in the Bardo a little while after that, and each book very fortuitously kind of came at a point where I'd basically given up. So I had the narrator, I had the father, I had the setting, I had that kind of arc of the feeling a reader should get from this. And then I had this third sort of threatening voice that may or may not be a devil, depending on how people may want to look at that. But to the question about experimentation or playing with language, I mean, that's something I love and I really admire it. And I'm very interested in people who bring almost like tools of poetry, like very sharp, very concise language into fiction, where you get a sense like every single word is critical, is absolutely doing a job. But reading, Lanny with the chorus of voices in the village, but also it has this other sinister voice behind it. Discovering that after I'd started, it's like, okay, this is great. There's space for me to try and develop something that's mine, that might feel a bit challenging, or might feel a bit strange or different, but actually if somebody else has found their own version of something in a similar sort of space, that kind of gave me a freedom to do it, and to pick it back up. So, I'd kind of given up. I read Lanny, I got going again, I gave up again a little while after. Read Lincoln the Bard, I was like, right, okay, I'm not going to write a book as good as that, but there is space to take risks with language in literature when you're pushing towards something, where you have a clear sense of where you're going to go. And I think it was that freedom, which coupled with nobody knew I was doing it, which I think I needed. I think if people knew I was doing it, I probably would have been much more reticent, conservative about how I was going into that. I think that let me, it's a bit like, it's taking the handbrake off. It's just saying, right, let's just go. Let's just see where this lands. And I think I was always driven, as I've said, by, make it matter, don't worry about making it good. So, which sounds a bit back to front, but actually it needed to resonate with me and feel powerful and feel important. And it was doing quite a personal job. If that then turned into a good book at the end of it, then fine, great. If it didn't, it could still have a value. It's just nobody else would have read it. So.
Another writer that you admire is Murakami, and he writes a lot about running, or he has written a really amazing book about running. And running is something that's really important to you as well. Do you want to speak a little bit about that? Because that's also the main character is also running, and the father.
Yeah, so again, fragments of me that sort of come into both those characters, as you say. Running, along with writing, has always been one of the ways that I've managed my own mental health. It's just such an escape, and Murakami writes really brilliantly about how, as a novelist, he doesn't go on a run to solve that character issue or that plot point. He runs to escape all of that. So actually, on a run, you're out of breath, you're enjoying the scenery, whatever you might be doing, but you're separated. There's a wordlessness that you can get into that actually you leave language behind, and that that feeling is something that is. It's quite remarkable. It's critical to me. I need it, but I was really interested in how can I create the feeling of being on a run and the rhythms of that in a book. How can I transfer that across into words? So where you might be challenged on a run, where it might be difficult, where you're slowed going up a hill. How can that have a feeling in the text and the words that are coming across? But I think the other bit I take from Murakami is, and that brilliant book about running, is he talks about how the closeness of the discipline between the two. So actually how running for him has been a training, like a way of developing the stamina and the endurance that he needs to write novels. So as well as being an escape, it's also a way of building up that strength. And I think I found, when I read that, the first time, I think that gave me a clear sense of almost like it contextualized the challenge of writing a book. It's like, right, okay, so I've run, I've trained for races, there's been challenges, you get injured, you stop running for periods of time, but you get back again. And I think he allowed me to see how I could probably approach writing the same way, that actually to become a good runner might take years and years of very slow, steady work all by yourself. Actually, writing's not dissimilar at all.
Yeah, that muscle memory of getting into the
and
habit.
the frustrations and the exhaustion. These can both be tiring in very different ways. But there's an interplay between the two that he does write beautifully about that I find really fascinating.
Yeah, I think Murakami's interesting as well, because I don't know if everyone knows, but I shared this with you before. There's a library in Japan in the university, and it's Murakami's library, and it's he's given his books, it's his archive, but it's also his jazz collection. And you listened to jazz music as well as you were doing this, and it's the whole library has been designed by Kengo Kuma, who was involved in the architect of the V&A Dundee as well. So it's interesting connections for you.
Yeah, no, which is lovely. I mean, I do. Again, I mean, I don't really. Music doesn't come into this book, but the way Murakami writes about music is really sensational. There's something really fascinating about that. But we were talking about this a little bit before. I mean, the point about how music does relate to the creation of Fray is when the book was bought, when HarperCollins said that they wanted to publish it. It was originally at that point, it's only 30,000 words long, so it was very short, it's very sharp, and in their wisdom and with the great experience of my editor, they saw there was a beginnings of a book that could be developed and could be taken further on. The challenge, though, is that the 30,000 words that took me 4 years, there was then maybe 6 months to turn it into 50 or 60,000. So, and a job as well at the same time. So I just very calmly sat down and said, right, I need to write 300 words every single day, no excuses. So there was a record that I would put on in my headphones, and that became, it's like the running, it becomes the routine of same kit, same route, go out and do it. It was actually same seat, same music. I did this yesterday, so fine, I can do this today, and I'm not going to be scared about the fact I don't have very long to finish this off. So yeah, there's that helped, that worked, but it's also, again, it comes back to that thing about rhythm. So the rhythm of running and the rhythm of music, and actually the rhythm of what I like in writing, that you feel cadence and you feel pace and you feel where something picks up and you feel where it slows down. That was something I always wanted to get into it. And music, I think, helped me feel comfortable with that, perhaps.
Yeah, and you definitely get that feeling of pace for sure. But I take it that bit you didn't write on the bus.
No.
Was this the point where you got support from Creative Scotland to focus on writing?
No, that's later. So I'm hugely grateful that Creative Scotland is supporting me for my second novel, so which came after all of this to do with Fray. So I've been able to spend some time not on a bus, sort of thinking about all of that. But no, the completion of the book was all, like, first draft was bus, second through 10th drafts, whatever it was all at home. But again, it was do the day job, come home, and then just sit down and just hit the 300 words and step away.
And I'm fascinated, since I heard that, to wonder which parts you changed, which bits are added in, and how did you choose how to do that? Did it feel like a precious thing that would unravel and fray, perhaps, when you started pulling aside?
I mean, to start with, in my naivety, with my 30,000 words that I shared with Jenny, my agent, and then went out to publishers to consider, I was totally, like, every fibre of my being, convinced that not a single word was out of place. Every bit of punctuation, like, you couldn't touch it or it would break. It would be ruined forever. And then you face the publishing realities of them saying, well, okay, but that's lovely, but how about 20,000 words on top? And that was really frightening. That was really, like, again, it was doing it for the first time, not having any sense of how that might work. But, with the support of an amazing editor, guiding, sort of gently steering me in the right direction, I think what became clear very quickly is I can't just cut this open in the middle and add 3 more characters and, take them away to somewhere else and bring them back. Like, whatever I do has to maintain the intensity. And I've had a few friends who've sat down and they've read it end to end in one go because they've kind of really, really been drawn into it.
Yeah.
So I was painfully aware that whatever I did couldn't undo the other work that was there. And so I was talking to somebody about this recently, and I think the best way I have of describing it is, and this fits what you're saying about fraying, is thinking about carefully unstitching a bit of fabric, putting something in, but then I had to then look back and look forwards in the text and work out, right, okay, how do I thread that through? How do I, if I've introduced a new challenge or a new problem, or I've developed something, I need to probably give the reader a warm-up to that that's mixed in with other bits. So it might get mentioned 1, 2, 3 times before. So it gets, the text was opened up, little bits put in that were then attached and kind of anchored around them. And then that might take 30,000 to 32,000. You stop and you've then got a hole, and you start again with, right, okay, so the next bit is maybe the pace slackens, or this bit's not quite as tense as it could be, and do the same things. It was very careful and very meticulous. And I think probably one of the things I'm proudest of is, it's recognizably the same book. It's not, as I say, we didn't have 3 more characters, they didn't go on holiday, they didn't have a whole thing. It's the same. It is the same book, but it's developed and it's stronger and it's better for it. And I think that's where I had faith that, making it longer in and of itself isn't necessarily the right thing to do, because there are many short books that are completely brilliant and you wouldn't want them to be more than 15,000, 20,000 words. But quite quickly I had a sense of, right, okay, this is getting better. So, okay, I'm going to trust in the process. I'm going to trust that they're asking the right challenging questions of me, and there's more to give. And what's lovely in that is you develop as a writer as well. So, I've had this conversation with a few people about, when I had finished it, self-publish, put it out. And that was, that was tempting to a degree. But I would never have had that opportunity for the work to develop and for me to develop to a point where I now feel totally different about starting the second. So.
That's so interesting. I think that analogy with tapestry or weaving and fabric is really interesting, because often, writing does take that form, and, did many years ago. And it's interesting, all that weaving together. So do you want to speak a little bit about the new novel as well, the one that we can...
I think a very little bit, because it's still kind of early days. I mean, I'm probably about halfway to a first draft, which I now understand will not be the final. That I get. But that actually, it's really interesting, because that's really freeing, because I've a sense that I think this second book, which isn't related to the first one, it's totally different setting and issues and characters. But I now know that it's fine for me to write a shorter first draft where I get the structure right and I get everything sort of in the right place. And I actually feel a sense of relief that I know I can go back and add 20,000 words afterwards, should I need to, or should the book need it. But the second one then is going to, again, connect to personal experience, but particularly my experience of being diagnosed as autistic, which for me happened about 1.5 years ago. And what I'm very interested in is the range of experiences of autistic people, which are massively diverse. And the book is using a family over different time periods, so it covers 100 years. So there's currently 3 principal time periods. That might change, but it's looking at the different experiences of families and the levels of discrimination that they face, the levels of misunderstanding that they have at different time periods, but also looking to what connects all of them. So the commonalities between the grandmother, the mother, the grandson. So it is early, but but it's been good. It's been really useful to take what I've learned from the first one and be able to move quickly into developing another one. Again, generously with Creative Scotland's support. But the other thing that's probably worth saying is I am still stuck with forests. I've just moved. So I've moved from West Coast to East Coast. So
it's still Scotland.
It's still Scotland. So,
of course.
But
Where else?
So currently it's much nearer home. So it's not a 3-hour drive away. It's more like a 20-minute drive. So research is a bit easier for this one.
Well, that's fantastic. I think that's definitely something for us to look forward to. It sounds, again, something that's based on your experience, but not entirely of your experience. But it also feels like you're really growing into this journey of the craft of being a writer, and which is wonderful.
Yeah, I think there's, I think creative confidence can be hard fought, can be a very fragile thing, and it's a really odd thing that maybe it's not odd. That's probably the wrong word. I find it interesting that it took me to write and properly finish a book, like the full 55,000 that is there, that's on shelves that people are buying. It took me to do that to stop being scared of writing, or indeed of actually reading other people's books and thinking, I'm not as good as that. Understanding now that firstly that doesn't matter, that's a terrible criteria to sort of judge yourself on anyway, but also what I need to do is I just need to be able to deliver the best version of a book that I can, and I suppose fight to make that as uniquely me as possible. And I think that's where I get a lot from, as we've talked about, taking fragments, taking bits of things I understand, but then creating something new out of them. Yeah. But it has taken 20 years of writing and including 7 on this to get to a point where actually I feel confident to do that, which is odd, but it's true.
I don't think it's odd. I think it's really interesting journey for people, and I know that a new award has just been released for emerging writers post 50, and a lot of people do come to writing later in life. I think it's really inspirational that you've shown that you can hold down a job, have a family, write, and manage your own mental health as well. And the fact that you're talking about all of that really openly, I think is really inspirational. And it's also just a really brilliant read. So, huge congratulations.
Thank you very much.
Chris. I think I'd like to open it up for any questions from all of you. We've got people online as well, so can you let me know if there's any questions there?
Can I ask a question? Chris, what advice would you give to someone starting out on the journey of writing their first novel stroke book?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, come back to what I said earlier on. I think for me, it's about why you're doing it. So my experience was very much wanting to write for myself, not wanting to write to be published, not really wanting to write, at least early on, for other people to read it. And I think there's something, and other people might respond differently. I know lots of people who get a lot out of being part of writing groups and sharing their work. That's never been for me. I've never really been able to do that. I think if you want to write, obviously get on and write, but know that it might take a very, very, very long time, but none of the time is wasted. So I think that's one of the things I find really interesting looking back, is how getting into a career in journalism and then working in communications meant that I was fortunate that in my day job I was writing all the time, and it was about different things. It wasn't fiction, but I was dealing with language all the time. So if you are aspiring to write, do it for your own reasons, but also if you can find a job where you are working with language, that's an incredible apprenticeship, or it was for me, because you're thinking about audience, you're thinking about storytelling, you're thinking about how to connect to people, And actually, those are all tools that, you know, might take you years to really get the hang of. But once you have possibly learned them in a different area, you can bring that into fiction or into, you know, narrative non-fiction or whatever people may want to write.
And you love bookshops as well, don't you? I've seen you on Instagram visiting different bookshops, because another part of you often find people being involved in the creative writing process, but in libraries and bookshops we often find people are drawn to them who want to be writers as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think there's excuse me, I just think booksellers are the best, and there's something wonderful about people who are so knowledgeable about and passionate about something and want to share it with you. So, you know, when I was building up to releasing the book, I had just a fun social media thing of buying books by authors from the bookshop nearest to them. So just kind of, you know, not literally traveling around the country, but, you know, buying Ian McMillan from his local Barnsley bookshop and these sorts of things, and Jenny Fagan from here in Edinburgh, whatever it might be. And it's just a nice, it's probably a way of me diverting the spotlight of like, yeah, I'm doing a book, but look at these great people, I'll talk about them instead. But no, I love bookshops, and I find them to be like libraries, to be amazingly peaceful places. Like, I'm not, because I have some sensory sensitivities, being autistic, I'm not good in a busy space, and there's just a sense of tranquility and peace in a good bookshop that is quite hard to get anywhere else.
Yeah. It's definitely something we treasure in the library as well, is making spaces for that, because we know people are drawn to that and come to visit us for that reason, for that space to think. Sure. But yes, Kenny will bring the mic. Poor Kenny's cost of shoe leather.
This relates to your process, and probably having listened to you to the first 30,000 word draft that you did. The way that you wrote in pieces, and then the seemingly random way the notes are read, although it forms a very nice narrative. I wondered if the pieces you wrote stayed in the position that you originally put them in, or if you had that experience of maybe, I don't know, printing the notes out and moving them around out of the pieces that you wrote, or did it come out in that narrative form?
Great question. No, that's a brilliant question.
I did toy with the print it all out, throw it up in the air and see where it lands, but I'm probably far too meticulous and controlling to like be comfortable with that. So the first version, as went to the publishers, was all written in order. So, you know, where it jumps around, where the father's notes feel like they're connecting and then that connection falls away, or it feels like suddenly you've jumped a season and he's forwards or he's backwards, or, you know, it's moving around. That again it was about the reader's sense, you know, it's about pacing, but it's about the reader's sense of intensity. So if it felt like in moments things were maybe going too smoothly, it's like, right, okay, how can I turn against that? How can I, you know, if me as the writer and the narrator are both feeling like we're going to discover something, and that's going to then, just at that moment, I want that to crumble in some way or to be subverted in some way. So that was how it went to start with. But then when you go into the editorial process and you have, you know, brilliant, challenging questions being asked of you, some of it moved around, but not lots. It was more about adding more in and finding where a moment of either connection or disconnection, because they are equally important in the book, but finding where we can maybe do more with that and add in a few more notes, or where I was maybe just being too kind to the narrator and it was going well, and they can maybe sort of spoil that a bit.
I know, it's fascinating. Yes. Clive.
Yeah, hi Chris.
Hello.
Good to see you. This is, I guess, this is a question about, you've obviously had that experience of Abate and what goes on around there, and I've not read the book yet, but how you describe it seems to lend itself towards potential non-linearity as well, and I just wondered whether or not the discipline of taking that into a linear space was in itself a challenge, but also whether or not there are kind of transmedia versions of this kicking around in your head and things that could be done with it beyond that.
Yeah, it's a really good question. Thank you. It's something I've played around with, the thought of. I mean, I've not done anything with it yet. I think quite early on I had a sense of, what's the best thing to do with this? Should this be first and foremost, a play? Should this first and foremost be a bit of film or something else? Not that I have experienced those things, but I didn't have experience of writing a novel, so it wouldn't have been any more ludicrous. But there's definitely something about again, come back to that feeling of being lost and being separated and not being quite sure what's going on, that actually digital technology is incredibly good at doing, and also that people could have a different story experience based on decision or a different story experience based on actual randomness. So I think if I was to do anything like that, it would have to have value in and of itself, and I don't know if this would be the work for that. You could maybe do a companion piece, because there's brilliant things where there's even games where you have a game that has a sort of a support game, and the two play between each other. And so there's Simogo company did a game called Year Walk that had its own companion app, and you literally had to check it. And something really fascinating about doing that, how you can build story and experience over more than one thing that you are having to deal with. But I feel like to do it properly, I probably need to start from scratch on something else. But then there's also the temptation of writing the thousands of notes and sticking them in a thing, and don't know, we'll wait and see.
Yeah, the sort of links to your question about the notes, you can just see it all being randomised and, it just kind of shuffling and moving around, yeah?
It absolutely could, yeah. I don't quite have the energy to try and do that at the minute, but yeah, definitely.
But I also can really see it as a play or a film, just the landscape and the simplicity and the things. I could see it moving beyond the page in a sense as well. I get your point, Clive. Any other questions? Yes, I've got one here a moment.
Hi, Chris. You mentioned, developing as a writer, starting to think about the audience more. Obviously, when you're on the bus writing the book initially, it sounded like you were initially doing it for yourself. At what point, or does it change how you're thinking about the audience, and if so, at what point?
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's funny, so there's maybe a slight contradiction there with how I was approaching it and with sort of how I would describe that. That I was writing it for myself, like I wasn't intending to, at that point, to share it with anybody, and I certainly had no sense of publishing it ever. But equally, probably because of that, those previous years of writing, and also as we talked about this, of the apprenticeship in professional life, of always writing for an audience, I think the work always had that focus. It's just I didn't want to show it to the audience, I think was probably the thing. So those considerations that you would have as a writer about how you bring an audience with you, how you connect them, how you want them to feel and what you want them to engage with, all of that thought process was there. I just, at least initially, had no intention of showing it actually to anyone. I think that's...
We got time for one last question at the front, Kenny. We have one here and then I know that we're...
Thank you. There is a big literature of the relationship between mental health, mental illness and creativity. I was wondering how you feel your own autism relates to your creativity.
Yeah, no, thank you. It's a really good point. In ways I didn't appreciate when I was writing this would be the honest answer. So, you know, there's parts of the narrator and how they function that I can see now are, again, there's little fragments of me, but I didn't realize until after I'd finished the book actually related to the way my brain functions, which is very different to most people's. I think, you know, creating this has been really interesting. One of the things I always wanted to do was create something that was, you know, challenging and hopefully has some literary merit, but also is totally accessible. So that's partly about audience and enjoyment, but I think it's also about that that commonality we all have, that we all have mental health in every moment of every day that we're alive. And sometimes that's good, sometimes that's bad, and it varies for all of us. So while it's dealing very specifically with a circumstance and these characters, while it's coming from me and my own very specific individuality and my own challenges, I hope it also has that wider resonance that actually people can connect to it themselves. But there's definitely bits in there about routine, which is a big thing for me, about anxiety, which is that relates to some of the challenges I have as being autistic, and those experiences are definitely, I can now see, are in the book. I just didn't know at the time what they actually were, to be honest.
Chris, you've been running up the hill and you're at the peak now. So we really appreciate you taking the chance to come and speak to us tonight, because I know you've had a whirlwind of activity around the publication. It's been really fascinating to get that in-depth understanding of how this novel came around and came about and came to life. So we do have copies of Fray outside that Chris is going to be on hand to sign. If any of you would like to pick up a copy, you don't have one already, it's usually $14.99, but we've got a discount, it's £12 tonight. Chris, can I just ask you all to just give a really warm thank you to Chris. Thanks to all of you as well. Thanks very much. Good night.